Hi everyone, it's been a while. So in my last video on I May Destroy You, I talked about rather disturbing topics, mainly rape, sexual assault and abuse. I talked about why good representation is crucial for survivors. I talked about the sort of portrayals that I personally find harmful and those I find empowering. But in today's video I want to talk about how in some cases victims tend to idealize and cling to their abusers. I want to talk about how romanticized portrayals of the student-teacher trope and of the age gap trope may encourage victims to view their traumatic experiences as a love story, how it encourages denial through the illusion of romance. So today we're going to talk about Kate Elizabeth Russell's debut novel, My Dark Vanessa. Before we get started, big trigger warning here. Once more, I'm going to talk about SA, rape and pedophilia. If you feel like any of this may be triggering for you, I truly encourage you to click off this video and watch something cute and wholesome, such as a video of a baby bat eating a banana, which is just the cutest thing you will ever see. But if, like me, you've become desensitized to these sort of topics because of the humongous amount of psychological numbing that you've had to put yourself through over the years to simply survive on this earth as a woman, feel free to stick around. So let's start with a brief summary of the novel. My Dark Vanessa tells the story of Vanessa Y, tracing her affair with her teacher, Mr. Strain, who is 42 years old when Vanessa is only 15. The book switches between two different timelines, the early 2000s and 2017. Now, both of these moments are very important moments in Vanessa's life, as the early 2000s mark the beginning of her relationship with Strain, and 2017 is the moment when, in the midst of the Me Too movement, a woman comes forward and accuses Mr. Strain of assaulting her when she was his student. The novel explores Vanessa's reluctance to acknowledge that what she had always considered to be true love is in fact abuse, which has isolated her from any other meaningful relationship in her life and robbed her of her potential. The reason I liked this book so much is because it tells the story of the victim that you usually don't hear from. The story of the victim who defends her abuser, who blames and accuses other victims of being liars. The story of a woman who, in her 30s, looks at teenage girls and tries to see them the way her abuser would have. The story of a woman who sees the man who groomed, raped, and abused her as the love of her life. I think it's an understatement to say that it's a tough read. To quote an article in the novel by The Guardian, it's hard to witness the repeated rape of a girl who is filled with longing and desire for a monstrous man. It's particularly difficult to read because it's both a story of abuse and of an embellished teenage girl's vision of true love, the latter forcefully superimposed on the former. Before we get into it, I want to take a moment to look at the title because I think it very cleverly establishes the unreliability of the narrator Vanessa, as well as the whole dynamic of the book. So it's called My Dark Vanessa. So although it's Vanessa's story, and although Vanessa is the narrator of the story, the title comes from Strain, her abuser's point of view. So we can already tell that his influence is pervasive, as though he's constantly infiltrating her perspective, her mind, and that he is shaping the way in which she is telling her story. I really like that because just from reading the title, we can tell that although Vanessa is telling the story, Strain is in control of the narrative. And throughout the book, the power of words and of storytelling, how we construct abuse as romance, coercion as seduction, and obsession as love, are pervasive themes, but we'll talk a bit more about that later on. For now, I want to talk about something that tends to come up very often when we talk about romanticization of abuse. There's always someone who's going to be like, well, is it really abuse though, because the victim seems to be into it. So let's unpack that. If we're going to understand what abuse is, it's crucial to understand what consent is. So, what even is consent? I think a dictionary definition would be something like agreement or permission, and I think that for a long time that's all it was to people. But nowadays we hear so many stories from people who didn't even seem to know that they were victims at the time of their assault. It seems that we as a society are starting to realize that consent just isn't that simple. For instance, what if you consent to something because you feel threatened? Because you're afraid to say no? Does that count as consent? What if you consent to something that you've never experienced before and you don't know what that involves? What if the other person has a lot more experience than you do? Does that create a power imbalance? And if so, does that mean that that person is necessarily taking advantage of you? Or can there be power imbalances that are, dealt with in a healthy manner? I would argue that that's possible, but that sometimes the power imbalance between two people is simply too overwhelming for consent to truly be possible. For instance, what if the other person is your boss, or your teacher, or your doctor, or I don't know, just someone with a lot of money and influence that you feel like saying no to them will have a negative impact on your opportunities? And to stay on topic, even if a person asks for it, begs for it even, can a child consent to having an affair with an adult? The answer, of course, is no. And I think that's one of the things that this book really aims to demonstrate. How agreeing to something as a child doesn't make the act consensual. Something that Vanessa points out repeatedly throughout the book is that Strain is cautious. He's very careful to absolve himself from any sort of blame. He's constantly asking for her permission, as though permission from a 15-year-old really is consent. He repeatedly tells her that she's in charge, that she decides what they do. He's very manipulative like that. He persuades her that she, like him, is dark, telling her that when he first met her, he thought, my god, this girl is the same as me, separate from others, craving dark things. To the reader, though, it's perfectly clear that Strain does not see Vanessa as she is, but rather he is telling Vanessa, a child, that she is a certain way. And because children simply aren't fully developed human beings by the time they're 15, he's actually making her see herself that way, as this dark seductress. And he uses what he has made of her, what he has turned her into by grooming her, as an excuse, as a justification for wanting her in the first place. And, later on as an adult, Vanessa tells herself that it must have been true, that she was dark, that she was like him, because a quote-unquote normal girl wouldn't have reacted that way. And in her mind, her reaction justifies the abuse she has experienced, or at least makes it less abusive. This brings us back to what I said in my last video, that because the media we consume tends to focus on the victim's behavior, and because it associates victimhood with purity and an angelic embodiment of womanhood, it's as though it's the victim that determines whether or not something is assault or abuse, when it is in fact always the abuser. I know I've said this before, but it is the person who is doing the assaulting that determines whether or not something is assault. If they violate your consent or your boundaries in any way, then it is assault. The victim's reaction or lack of reaction, or even in some cases the victim's willingness, cannot turn abuse into anything other than abuse. One of the things the book highlights, in my opinion, is that abuse can take place without the use of force or threat. You cannot have consent from another person if you use a position of authority or trust as a means of coercion. And more importantly, children can never consent to sex. I think most people would agree with this. The problem is that we, as a society, don't see teenage girls as children. And this is where the sexualization of young girls and the part it plays in rape culture becomes so relevant to this discussion. Growing up, Vanessa is surrounded by a culture that normalizes the sexualization of young girls, and it encourages her to see the abuse she is going through as normal. The book uses examples that I very well remember growing up in the 2000s, like Britney Spears, for instance, who was, I think, only 17 when her first big hit came out. And I remember vividly how disturbing it was, because it was as though it was her innocence, her baby face, her virginity, and the fact that she was still a child that made her so sexually appealing to the world. So the book doesn't just denounce the behavior of sexual predators like Strain, it underlies the culture that enables it. How girls are taught to mythologize adolescence and youth as their peak of sexual desirability, and how truly sick and disgusting that is. I'll spare you the details, but there were many instances when I was growing up where I felt like the fact that I was underage made me into this sort of forbidden fruit to men. As though I was that much more appealing because I was so innocent and vulnerable and I didn't even know what was going on, and basically I was just so inexperienced that I could make average, ordinary and exceptional men feel superior and powerful. And back then, as a teen you might enjoy the attention. I know that I partly did, but I think it messes you up in ways you can only realize when you're older. I know that for me personally, I realize how much it's forced me to see myself as an overly sexual being. As though it was not necessarily the most important thing about me, but the thing that defined me the most. And there's nothing wrong, about being a very sexual person, but when you realize that it's not something that you chose, but rather something that was forced upon you and that you embraced as a sort of defense mechanism, you realize it isn't necessarily as empowering as the people who were all too eager to take advantage of you wanted you to believe. This is turning into a therapy session. Anyways, once she's older, Vanessa seems to be aware that children or teens cannot consent to sex with a middle-aged man, because their brain, their frontal lobe to be exact, isn't developed until they are 25. But she nevertheless insists that she was different, even in the face of scientific evidence, her denial is unshakable. The fact that her brain hadn't fully developed to one of an adult when the abuse began increases the extent to which strain influenced Vanessa, not only her life, but as a person. In many ways, this book explores what happens when your abuser becomes a part of you, when you're shaped and molded by your abuser. Again, this is Vanessa's story, but it is Strain, her abuser's narrative. And because Vanessa was so young, there's simply no way to tell what she might have become if it wasn't for Strain's perverse influence. The loss of her potential as a writer, of all the lives she might have lived if it weren't for Strain, is a tragedy I think too many of us can relate to. One of the reasons I think Vanessa is so hard to like as a character is because it is impossible to separate her from her abuser. Again, as the title indicates, this character is as much herself as she is Strain, as much Vanessa as she is Dark and his, as though Strain's perception of her is just as much a part of her identity as her own name. So how can we explain the appeal for this sort of romance, which is inherently abusive because of the power imbalance? Why are audiences obsessed with the student-teacher trope and its romanticized portrayals in TV shows mostly aimed at young adults? The thing is that actors who play the part of teenagers in TV shows and movies are usually well into their 20s, and this helps us see teenagers as young adults. So while the actor who plays the teacher may be a bit older, the age gap isn't that important because the actors who are playing these teenagers are old enough to consent. But, the teenagers that these actors are portraying are not. And so this becomes really confusing to us as viewers. But what is the appeal of older, more mature people for these teenagers that the audience is projecting on? In the book, Vanessa tells herself, "I was the first student who put the thought into his head. There was something about me that made it worth the risk. I had something that drew him in." Vanessa says, "I feel forced over a threshold, thrust out of my ordinary life into a place where it's possible for grown men to be so pathetically in love with me they fall at my feet." So the book underlines how easy it is for someone older and in a position of power to make a young girl feel empowered, to act as though the power imbalance is reversed. The idea that an older person is attracted to you feels so empowering to a teenager because it makes us feel seen in a way we've never experienced. And this is why contradiction is so interesting in the book, because you see the story through your own point of view as an adult, but you also see it through Vanessa's point of view. And if you're anything like me, you see it through the eyes of your 15-year-old self. You see the horror, you see the abuse, but you also see the electricity of the interactions with Trains at the beginning. You see how it makes her into something so much more than she used to be. You see how it turns her into someone important instead of this unexceptional, ordinary girl she thought she was before she met Strain. And at the beginning, it feels to her like it's worth putting up with the physical discomfort of actually interacting with him. This contradiction between Vanessa's imaginary love and the physical reality of it, which is inherently abusive, is best exemplified, in my opinion, by their first kiss, when she comes into his office and tells him that she thought they might, quote, kiss or something. And when they do, her instinctive reaction is to observe how weird it is that he has a tongue. The book emphasizes that as a teenager, it makes sense to think that you're in love with a teacher or with an older person, because you're in love with a fantasy. And there's nothing wrong or perverted where the child is concerned. Regardless of your eagerness and of your enthusiasm, it is always up to the adult to say no, and not to take advantage of how vulnerable we are as teenagers. Vanessa convinces herself that Strain sees her as his soulmate, and that the fact that she happens to be 15 is just an accident. But to us, it's so disgustingly obvious that what Strain likes about her is that she is a child. And while Vanessa tries to act more mature in order to please him, Strain constantly infantilizes her because he is in fact not attracted to her specifically, but to young girls in general. Something else that I liked about the book is that it exposes one of the many paradoxes that comes with being abused. As an adult, Vanessa clings to her relationship with Strain as though it makes her special, different, and yet she is absolutely terrified of being defined by it. I just thought that was really interesting, how, you don't want other people to associate you with a certain thing, even though you yourself are unable to let that something go, even 17 years later. So let's talk a bit about this influence, this power that abusers have over the victim, in order to understand how it's possible for Vanessa to remain under Strain's influence even 17 years after the abuse. I'm going to be basing this part of the video on an experiment called the Skinner experiment, and on an article that demonstrates why victims tend to fixate on their abuser and why abuse in a weird way can become addictive. Tests have shown that we are more eager for rewards if they are given to us at random, intermittently rather than systematically. This is what we call intermittent reinforcement. The conclusions the researchers came to is that even if you stop giving the subject, rats in the original study, treats, they will keep pressing the lever even long after the treats stop coming, because if they are confused as to when they will get the reward, it is impossibly difficult for them to let it go. Basically, small and predictable rewards are a lot more addictive than systematic, regular ones. I know that it looks a bit odd to base all this analysis on an experiment made on rats, which, now that I think about it, isn't all that vegan of me, but as someone who's been in abusive relationships, this made so much sense to me. Because weirdly enough, after some times, it's as though the longer you wait, the harder it is to give up trying, because what if you just waited a little bit longer, You waited so long already. It's easier to just keep waiting and convince yourself that it will be worth it, rather than to just take a step back and realize that you have lost months or even years of your life for something that will never come. As I've said, intermittent reinforcement basically means manipulating people through an inconsistent cycle of rewards and punishment. I'll leave the link to the article down below if any of you are interested, but the gist of it is that when you know the reward is coming after you take a certain action, you tend to work less for it. But when you don't know when to expect it, when it is unpredictable whether or not that reward is coming, you will tend to repeat that behavior with even more enthusiasm in hope for the end result. When it comes to abusive relationship, this intermittent reinforcement is almost always at play, and the hope for those unexpected few rewards often encourages the victim to stay in the cycle. By the way, I use the word reward very loosely here. It doesn't necessarily mean chocolate or flowers. Sometimes a reward is just your abuser showing basic humanity, like remorse or affection. In my experience at least, the more time goes by, the more you're left begging for crumbs. I know it's going to sound obvious, but abuse and the trauma that it brings along make people vulnerable. You can develop things like an eating disorder, dissociation, insomnia, low self-esteem. So if you couple all that with the effect of intermittent reinforcement, that is literally the perfect setting to become addicted. Craving that long-awaited reward despite the punishments, despite all the evidence pointing to the reality that no reward is worth so much pain and effort. We simply cannot let go. I want to quote the article here because I'm not knowledgeable enough on the matter to put it in a more palatable way. Intermittent reinforcement affects us on a biochemical level. Activity in brain regions correlated with drug addiction light up when we receive these occasional, unpredictable rewards. In abusive relationships, where abuse is pervasive but pleasurable moments are unpredictable and few, the victim's reward circuit reacts just like the animals in Skinner's experiment. In other words, it's not our fault that we're still hooked on the people who constantly reject and abuse us. According to the science, we're literally like cokeheads, obsessing over our loss while craving reunion with our rejecting beloved addiction. One of the other reasons why many victims are unable to leave their abuser or immediately run back to them is something called euphoric recall. Quoting the article here, euphoric recall is the brain's way of motivating the victim to go back to the abuser so it could get another dopamine hit. As we said earlier, when in a cycle of abuse, the victim's brain is like a brain on drugs. It craves the rush of dopamine that comes with the irregular rewards the abuser grants them. If the victim manages to get away for a bit, their brain is low on dopamine and they will experience withdrawal. All too often, the victim caves in, craving approval and telling themselves that they will be better and manage to avoid punishment. This is one of the reasons why victims tend to blame themselves, because if we manage to believe the abuse is our fault, that means we have a level of agency in the situation. We can do better and collect more rewards. Blaming the other person means that the only thing to do is walk away, and our cokehead brains won't let us do that. Unfortunately, telling ourselves to try harder to please our abusers in the hope that we will finally get what we want seems a lot easier. At this point, I would like to point out that trying to please someone who harms us or is threatening to harm us is not some bizarre, freaky reaction that only one person in a million has ever experienced. It's actually the definition of what's known as the fawn reaction, one of the 5 ways the human body typically responds to trauma. When we experience something traumatic, the body releases hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and this is something that we have no control over. It's a mechanic, automatic response to danger. So this little cocktail of hormones can cause a person to react in a variety of ways. This is a bit of a generalization, but you can sum it up with the 5 Fs. Freeze, basically you're paralyzed. Flop, you do what you're told and you're unable to resist or protest. Fight, you resist or protest. Flight, you hide or you run. And fawn, you try to please a person who is perceived as a threat. So please stop blaming yourself, stop shaming others for the ways in which they respond to the hormones their bodies release because they are fucking terrified. Judging someone's reaction to trauma is like telling someone on their period, look, I know it's that time of the month, but can you please stop bleeding? You're being a drama queen. The point I'm trying to make is that there is no such thing as a willing victim. If someone hurts you, violates your boundaries or your consent in any way, or pressures you to do something, makes you do something, you are a victim. What people may call your willingness is actually a natural human response to traumatic situations. I would also like to point out that by comparing abusive relationships to drug addiction, I'm absolutely not saying that it's impossible to get out or that there's no point in trying to get out. That is not what I'm saying, and that is not true. I'm just saying that blaming ourselves and shaming others really doesn't help anyone, and in fact it makes the matter worse. Because the more ashamed we are, the harder it is to feel like we deserve the necessary support to get out of abusive situations. Now that we've explored the notion of sexual consent and we've talked about why victims tend to cling to their abusers because the relationship as a whole becomes a form of drug to them, let's talk a little about something that makes it even more difficult, not just to leave, but simply to acknowledge that the abuse is even there at all. Let's talk about denial. So, denial is a cognitive distortion. Basically, your mind convinces the person who is experiencing something traumatic that it isn't happening or that it hasn't happened. This may explain why some rape victims convince themselves that it was actually sex, despite, fully knowing that this is not what sex feels like. It's basically our brain protecting us from the horror of experiencing the horror of what we're experiencing. To go back to our case study here, Vanessa, denial may result in the victim convincing themselves that they enjoyed something that was forced upon them. Again, when you're a teenager, you're typically not very familiar with things like sex and so on. So when an adult introduces you to it and manipulates you into thinking that you want it, believing that you like what your abuser is doing to you is a form of denial. I know it may sound strange to some, but when there is no escape to something you're experiencing, convincing yourself that you like it may be the least unbearable solution. And maybe the more awful it gets, the more you need to adore and glorify it to protect yourself from the horror and the violence of it all. I would argue this is one of the reasons why some victims think they are in love with their abuser. My Dark Vanessa explores how victimhood can be regarded as a choice. If you convince yourself it's love, then it cannot be rape. This is the idealized vision of love as salvation. Refusing to be a victim, Vanessa insists, he loved me, as though the love he had for her can turn the abuse he suffered into something acceptable, something she can live with. However, Vanessa does have moments of clarity, and at times she is able to see how perverse and wrong this whole thing with Strain is, but she comes back to the love story narrative. She is so protective of the idea of their being in love because she needs it. It's the only version of reality she can bear to live with. There's this beautiful scene at the end of the novel when Vanessa has a meltdown and tells the therapist, I can't lose the thing I've held on to for so long. I just really need it to be a love story. Because if it isn't a love story, what is it? This is my life. This has been my whole life. Denial is also fascinated by the fact that in real life, rape and abuse often don't look like the way we as a society generally imagine those things. This is expressed very well by Vanessa when she says, comparing herself to another rape survivor, I wasn't abused, not like that, not raped. It's as though, on some level, she knows that what she experienced was rape, but she refuses to label it as such because it simply doesn't fit what she always thought rape to be. In someone else's mouth, she argues, the word turns ugly and absolute. It swallows up everything that happened. Here the novel touches on how the language around rape has been weaponized in a way that makes it very hard for victims to use to their advantage. It shows how the word rape has become so hard for victims to claim. and how difficult it is for them as a result to acknowledge that they are victims, which also explain why they tend to blame themselves. It is also particularly hard for Vanessa to get out of denial because Strain remains a controlling presence in her life for years. By the time she's a fully grown adult, she has been shaped and molded by Strain to the extent that she views him as her victim, painting herself as his accomplice to the reader. In the book, Vanessa describes victimhood as a continuation of childhood, as a rejection of responsibilities, as choosing to be taken care of by others, as though victimhood is something that you choose. The difference between sex and rape, she says, is state of mind. You can't rape the willing. This is obviously untrue. But if you put yourself in that mindset for a second, it kind of makes sense that you would convince yourself that you are willing as a way to reject victimhood. It's a form of denial that leaves the victim with a sense of agency. It would explain why, 17 years later, she still needs to see herself that way, as the girl who lured him in and made him into what he is, because it's the only form of power she has left. That's the thing when you've been conditioned to view victimhood as a choice. You don't fucking choose it. We can see in this novel why this illusion of a choice is so hard to let go. Losing control over your body is terrifying. It is unbearable to accept the fact that someone can use, hurt, and abuse you and that you are completely powerless. But it is in fact this illusion of a choice, this framing of victimhood as a state of mind that keeps you in denial. But seeing ourselves as responsible for the abuse we experience is not just about wanting to take control back. The reason why it was so easy for Vanessa to blame herself is because when Strain tells her, "I never would have done it if you weren't so willing," the society and culture she's grown up in are all too inclined to agree. In the book, the themes of storytelling and denial and the illusion that we are in control of our own narratives if we manage to paint ourselves a certain way, as though we can either choose to be a helpless victim or choose to be a dark seductress, are pervasive. This is just so interesting to me, and I loved how the book denounces how toxic this false choice is. This idea that if you're able to present your story in a certain way, then you are able to rewrite it. You're not, but it is very tempting. I mean, when you think about it, who wouldn't choose a love story over an abuse story? Who wouldn't choose to be a powerful temptress rather than a helpless victim? And trauma really does create the perfect mental environment for survivors to rewrite what happened. Vanessa says in the book that her memories are shadowy, incomplete, that she needs Strain to fill in the gaps. And although, quoting Vanessa here, the girl Strain describes sounds like a stranger, Vanessa is compelled to identify with this version of herself that he has created. Because again, although rape is not a choice on the part of the victim, it is never a choice. Denial can be conceived that way, and what 15-year-old would choose rape and trauma over a love story? To quote a New York Times article on the matter, "We protect ourselves with memory, we lie to ourselves, we make things into what we can handle." Almost every time they interact, Strain creates a narrative, and all Vanessa has to do is slip right into it, no matter how uncomfortable it feels. I'm not going to describe the scene in which Strain rapes Vanessa for the first time, because I don't want to put anyone through that, to be honest, but just trust me on the fact that it is not a grey area. It is pretty brutal and horrible to read. The point is that the horror of what happens is unmistakable to the reader as well as to Vanessa, but then he rewrites what happens. After he rapes her, he tells her, "We made love, didn't we?" And this is not a question. He is actively rewriting the way she thinks about what he has just done to her. This is how the novel emphasizes how powerful words are, especially when an adult introduces a child to something they know nothing about. This scene just makes it horribly clear that whatever the adult says in this situation will become the child's reality, because they just don't know any better. And because the culture they grew up in will reinforce this message. So, in conclusion, although this is undeniably a very, very tough read, I am glad that we have this representation of victimhood, especially for victims who probably have a hard time identifying with stereotypical representations of rape survivors. It seems very important to me that everyone feels seen and validated in their experience, if only to help alleviate the unjustified shame that they may feel. I love that this book doesn't shy away from the ambiguity and the uncertainty that comes with sexual assault. I mean, that is literally what the novel is all about. In my opinion, it helps validate the experiences of survivors who are often offered no representation, and in my opinion, it never glorifies these sorts of relationships. To me, what the book says to people who can relate to this experience of victimhood is that it doesn't matter that there were times when you enjoyed it. It doesn't matter that you created this narrative and rewrote what happened. It doesn't matter if you fantasize or idealize your abuser. That doesn't invalidate the times when you didn't want to, the times when you were forced. And it doesn't alter the fact that the whole thing was toxic and wrong and that none of it was your fault. So I would just like to thank Kate Elizabeth Russell for that, because that is a very brave way to write about rape. I would like to leave you with a quote from that New York Times article, because I think the author puts it very well. One of the more radical aspects of the novel is that it maintains its ambiguities. It refuses to give up entirely the idea that there was love somewhere in this encounter, along with other sicker, darker things. In the words of Vanessa herself, driven toward him, I was the kind of girl that isn't supposed to exist. One eager to hurl herself onto the path of the pedophile. But no, that word isn't right. Never has been. It's a cop-out. A lie in the way it's wrong to call me a victim and nothing more. He was never so simple. Neither was I. Thank you so much to all of you who have made it this far. Not that I blame you if you haven't. I will link all of my sources and references down below. They've been a great help for me in writing this video. I also wanted to say that I realized as I was filming this that there are moments where I would just laugh and smile in a really weird way, and this is not... I mean, I hope there's no ambiguity. Like, I don't think any of this is funny. This is just... See, I'm laughing now. It's just this is the way I respond to these kind of topics. I'm not laughing because I think it's funny. It's just it's nervous. It's my defense mechanism. Anyways, sorry if that made any of you uncomfortable. Yeah, I hope you have a nice rest of your day, and yeah, I think I'll just go now. Okay, bye bye.